We'll give it a couple more minutes before we get started, but due to this size, I would encourage those who love the back row to come on up to the front and maybe even swing over to this side of the space.
I think this alone is a statement of why there's not enough women.
Thank you. We got a front row.
There's that.
We got a front row.
I don't think it's just that this is the last towards the end of the conference.
Some people don't see this as a worthy time.
That's right.
You're holding out on that side. No, you're close. All right.
Can we just acknowledge that the size of the audience for this conversation is pretty telling?
She just said the same thing.
It's pretty telling.
I had a moment. I also told myself it's the end of ASU.
And it's
GSV.
sunny out, so we're competing with sun. And
Sure,
Yes.
let's tell
There's been
ourselves
sun
that.
for 3 days.
Well, the last session was how, I think if I read it correctly, was how to eliminate or reduce bro culture in your startup, and there was probably half as many people, so.
There you go. We're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you for joining us. We're not going to do the traditional introductions of a panel. You can see the screen and who we have, incredible women here today, to talk about why, if we have a full pipeline, talent pipeline, why aren't more women leading in districts in higher education? And just to set the table, we know 76% of teachers are women. But when we start moving up the ladder, if you will, and we get to district superintendents, we drop down to 25% of district superintendents are women. And when we look at higher ed, vice chancellors, only 20% of vice chancellors are women. So what's happening here? I think it's a question to explore. I had the privilege of being actually in DC yesterday, so I'm on a red eye. So if I scramble my words, you'll know why. But I was in DC yesterday basically exploring the same question. Chiefs for Change, an organization committed to raising up the next generation and supporting this generation of district superintendents and state chiefs, was asking, why are we hitting up against this glass ceiling when it comes to education? We had former Governor Susana Martinez, the first female Hispanic governor in the country, commenting on these things in an incredible panel. And I will tell you, there's some great data around some spaces and places that we can really work together to change the dynamics. And so take a look at that report. But there's also a lot of differences in opinions. Today with our panel, I think what's exciting is we have the full continuum, if you will, through education all the way into the workforce. And I'm going to ask that we push and pull from our different perspectives and from our personal versus our professional if there's a difference in what we see. And I guess my first question, I'd love to just start out, and Jackie, I'm going to turn to you since you're on my left here. I think each of us has seen a lack of women in leadership in the roles that we've either filled or helped fill or called others to. Why? Why is this from your vantage point? And how is this impacting the education leadership sector as a whole?
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet. I do a lot of work with higher education institutions, so I'll just sort of disclaim that lens, which is sort of where I'm coming from. So I'm often involved as a consultant to organizations when they are looking to make a leadership change. I often will assist a search committee through a process and help them with a decision. So I have both a sort of a endemic, how do we get to this point, and then also in the decision process, what are we dealing with? And there's a whole bunch of topics and issues around pipeline development, and we can sort of get into that about are we making leadership roles that are even attractive to women? Are we encouraging women at every step to gather the right experience they need so as to position themselves long term, which I'm sure we'll have a conversation about. But in my experience as a search consultant, I often show up at the decision process, and I see a couple things happening. I see organizations that, I get it, these are high profile, high stakes roles, and particularly in group decision making, we tend to be risk averse. And so that means not bringing in candidates who might be what I might consider outside the box, thinking creatively about different industries or backgrounds that women might come from, and then also thinking very narrowly about what quality looks like. So and as a search consultant, part of my job is to help organizations have the confidence and the long-term perspective to think broadly about that. But I see both a long-term issue and sort of a short-term reality in the decision-making process around leadership changes.
Great. Nivine, what do you see?
So I think of just the issue of systemic bias, and I think it starts in the K-12 environment. There's studies out there, and I recently was reading one, a study about why girls were not excelling as much in STEM fields. And this researcher went in and observed and noticed that little girls always wanted to talk more about what the teacher was telling them. But it was always like, you need to be quiet and do your work. The result was that their performance was not as good. And the researcher said, I want you to just let them talk. And for several months, they just let them talk, and their performance actually then started to supersede the male boys, or the males. And I thought that was so interesting because already at an early stage, there is so much more need for social affiliation and learning together that we're tamping down and not allowing people to thrive and to reach their potential. And how does that manifest itself across the entire lifespan? And then I recently thought about the concept of the bias we have, and we choose people like ourselves. And who's in leadership? Primarily men. So they're going to choose other men. And I thought about my leadership team, that there was a period in my leadership at the university where I had primarily women. That was almost a full women's leadership team. And I have to actually look at it and say, I need balance here. And it is now a more balanced team. But I think just those biases, we don't even pay attention to their impact and how they undermine different individuals across the lifespan.
Yeah.
So,
Susan, Carmita.
So when I entered back in 2001, I started my superintendent training at the Harvard Urban Superintendents Program. And at that time, 11% of superintendents were female. So we've made some progress, but it's not great, right? So we're at 25%. Woo. So, and I can say that at that time, I tried looking for it. I recall reading an article, and I believe it was on the front page of Education Week around 2000, 2001, saying that women who wanted to get into the superintendency should really consider golf. No offense to my friends in the audience who golf, it's not my thing. And I'm certainly not going to have anybody tell me I need to make it my thing so that I can get ahead into a leadership position. But that wasn't that long ago. And that was still the narrative that I think was out there, and I think is still somewhat out there today. And so I was really fortunate that I had very, very powerful female role models in the superintendency. So I was able to do my superintendent internship under a woman named Vicki Phillips in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who went on to serve as the Secretary of Ed in Pennsylvania and then to the Gates Foundation. And having that female mentorship, I think, made a huge, huge difference. But I don't see enough of that now in the K-12 space. So I actually feel that I have a personal and professional responsibility to reach out to my fellow female superintendents and aspiring superintendents and talk about, how you make this work for you as a woman. But I just don't think we do enough of that proactive, honest conversation with women to try to get them into what is, on some days, a punishing job, and on other days, the most uplifting work that you'll ever do in your life. So, but we need folks who can give women the honest assessment of what they're walking into. And I will just say, too, that I teach in aspiring superintendent programs, and I'm in front of new superintendents or aspiring superintendents regularly, and I will, when I make my comments to the whole, then call out my female colleagues and say, and just so you know, the gender bias is alive and well, and I got stories for you later on that. But then I actually speak specifically to my female colleagues of color. And I say, I won't even pretend to know what you're going to go through, because I see what my female colleagues of color in the superintendency go through. And it's rough. It's really, really rough. And we're not having those honest conversations around the toll that this job can take without an adequate support system.
Yeah, great segue, thank you. I'll start by saying I think it's important to acknowledge all the intersectionality that we bring. So I come and speak to you as an unapologetically Black woman, cisgendered. I'm an entrepreneur. I am an engineer. I'm born and raised in poverty. I am Southern. And the reason that I share this is because one of the things that I think really is very pervasive in our systems is that we don't allow women, particularly, and those who identify as women, to show up as all of those things. We are very prescriptive about what it looks like to actually display the leadership traits that are required in order to have confidence, in order to be seen as one who is worthy of promotion, one who is worthy of leading. And it's a bit ironic because when you think about particularly all the, in the last 5 years, all the data that's come out about transformational leadership qualities, they are traditionally feminine, and I say that in quotes for a reason, but empathy, humility, the ability to actually bring together teams and lead in a democratic way. And those are things that we aspire to, and we know that they are very critical to transformational leadership. Yet when we think about how we search for talent, what we reward in behaviors, it is often the antithesis of those things. So we have to deal with some real dissonance around what we say we want and what we reward in this work.
Amen.
Well said. As you were talking, I was thinking, I mentioned Chiefs for Change, and a year ago, we looked at this future pipeline of state chiefs and district superintendents, and both men and women going through this training program of the pipeline. And what we saw was almost all the men getting the district and the state chief jobs, and almost all the women not. And so it was a point of I'm like, what's going on? What's the deal, right? And we launched and I had the privilege of launching a women kind of, let's take this to the next level. What's happening? What's the conversation? And by the way, within less than a year, we had 3 women placed in high state chief or district superintendent roles. And that leads me to believe there's some nuancing in this. One of the nuances was, and you alluded to this, Jackie, not all our women wanted to go into those chief roles because at the end of the day, they were not very attractive. And I agree with you, Susan, so rich, but also
punishing at times.
Yeah, they can take you to hell and back again. Maybe I shouldn't quite say it like that, but all that to say, so as you all think about this, what's the responsibility of women in this and the opportunity? And what's the responsibility for those who are hiring and the opportunity? And where are we falling short right now as we think about responsibilities and opportunities? And I tend to see this as an opportunity, but let's push and pull a little bit. Do we all have an opportunity and a responsibility in this?
Yeah. And I would just start and say, whether they're superintendents, university presidents, these jobs are brutal. They just are. If you're a public figure, there's a lot of slings and arrows, and so some of that we can't change tomorrow, and some of that sort of gets baked into a macro discussion about civility of discourse in this country. Let's just park that for now. But my point is, I think, I don't know about you guys, but I had to be nudged to be able for someone to say to me, "You should go up for partner." You're ready. And so I think we all have a responsibility to just nudge each other, because most women, there's so much research on this that women, we don't speak out unless we're absolutely certain of what we're saying. I see this all the time in the processes that I run. I see men raising their hand for jobs they're not remotely qualified for versus, most women are like, who, so, and I think to your point, there's also, we have to give support to women leaders that we have their back against those slings and arrows, rather than I'm going to be out there alone, naked in the blowing wind when the tough times come.
Well, I do think that there's both an individual and collective responsibility, place for individual and collective responsibility here. So from an individual basis, I think women who are in leadership roles and aspiring to advance or aspiring to leadership roles, making sure that you are seeking out those mentors and people, women in particular, who can be good supports to you. And one of the pieces of advice I would give, and it's based on a conversation I had just last evening with two women that I met, a new superintendent and a woman who's a former principal, and thinking about the superintendency at some point. And of course, the two superintendents said, "Oh my gosh, you should absolutely be a superintendent." And she laughed and she mentioned a man that the two of them had worked with in their district years before. And when she had mentioned to him that she might be thinking about the superintendency, his response was, "Do you really think you're ready? Do you think maybe you should consider a director level role first?" Now, neither here nor there, I don't know her, so maybe he knows something about her qualifications that I don't. But my takeaway from that and my advice to young women aspiring, don't listen to the men. Because unfortunately there still may be a propensity for them to sell you short a little bit. So surround yourself with people who will push you and challenge you when you don't think you're ready. And I'll just say, personally, I'll never forget sitting on an airplane with Vicki Phillips, and I was, at that time, her executive assistant at the Department of Ed, and I'd been there 6 months, and she said, "I'm going to do some restructuring, and I'm going to put you in charge of teaching and learning for the state of Pennsylvania." I was 34 at the time. And I was like, I don't know if I'm ready. And she said, "I do." And it was just that, she said, without flinching, she said, "I do." So knowing that you have people that will help you see what you don't see in yourself is critical.
I want to build on Susan's point, because Susan, what you're talking about goes beyond mentorship, and I think it's really critical that we make this explicit. What women and those who identify as women need is sponsorship. That goes beyond mentorship. So a mentor will sit and talk to you and tell you all about the good times and the bad times they've had and their experiences. Mentorship becomes about the person giving something, right? Sponsorship is, I am going to take the power that I have and wield it on your behalf. And that is something that we often conflate those, and they're very different.
Thank you.
So I think there are individual and there's a community response that's required, but recognizing that we can't wait, and I say this with all respect to every man and those who identify in the room, but we are not waiting on you to relinquish any power. We are taking it. And I'll add, for me, in my work, because we haven't thrown these stats out there, this is even more critical for women of color, because while 25% of superintendent CEOs are women, less than 6% of them are folks of color. So this is real. And 11% of board members, I could rattle off all the stats. And when you think about the fact that we're operating, at least in a K-12 space, that is over 50% Black and brown children, it is very critical for us to understand that our leadership, we effectively cannot change systems on behalf of those that we represent if they are not at the table influencing and making those decisions. And we've got to recognize that leadership may or may not look and feel the same, but in order to get to different results, we need different leadership driving it.
Let me ask you, Carmita, you said we're not waiting, we're taking. What does that look? Give some tangible examples.
I will. So what it means is, I think, to build on this point, doing what Vicki did, it is recognizing that when we have power, so I'll give you an example. And I say this not just because she's leading this whole thing, but Deb Quazzo has been an amazing mentor of mine for years. She did not know me at all. She saw me present somewhere in Chicago a dozen years ago, came up to me afterwards, I had no idea who she was, and said, "You are onto something, and I'd like to sit down and talk to you and just learn more about you." She didn't have to do that, but she did. She's and a conversation that I have with her that I think just underscores so many things is we were talking about this notion of sponsorship and making space for other folks, and she said, "You know, we operate as if there's fixed pie. And many people are not willing to use the power that they have because they believe that they're actually going to lose it. And when we really break through is when we recognize we can make more pie. Like, my giving of myself to you is actually I will get that back exponentially. So I think we have to do things like that. We also, and we're among family, we have to create safety nets. We have to allow women and those who identify as women to fail just as much as we allow mediocre white men to fail. And we have to, and we have to create those trampolines, not just the nets, so that when we do fail, when we do have setbacks, we can bounce back up. And those are things that I think we have to be intentional about.
Couldn't agree with you more. I was struck. I had a conversation yesterday about the difference between being a steward of something and being a multiplier. And when you're a multiplier, you fundamentally believe that there's so much more out there. When you're a steward, you might just hold on to what you got. And I think in this space, there's an incredible opportunity to be multipliers. Susan, you mentioned the statistics and how they've gotten better, but we're still
Not great.
We've got a lot more opportunity. I want to switch though and say, what are the good things that have? I mean, let's look back over the last 10 years. I would posit, could be wrong, 10 years ago, this conversation wouldn't be happening. So what do we see happening and moving that we want to see more of? And then if you would like, what do we want to see less of in this space and this conversation around the kinds of questions we're asking and posing and the kinds of actions we're pushing and or not.
So, I'd say 20 years ago, when women actually started making any moves, it seems, into the ranks, that what I noticed at the time was that women who were able to do it, they had sponsorship, but it was from men. Because there were only men to sponsor them. Generally men with daughters who were looking and going, crap, I don't want my daughter to go through what I see these other women going through, so they sponsored women on up. I think one of the things that's changing is today there's 30% of women who are presidents today at universities, as opposed to 25 even in 2011. And so it's moving in the right direction, and now there's the opportunity for women to do the same sponsorship for other women and to really reach down and help others to achieve those ranks. And I think there's also the opportunity to start creating a different narrative that speaks to how leadership comes in different flavors, and that the flavor that women bring can be incredibly effective and transformational as your data and everyone's, we know the data says so. And the opportunity to really create a different narrative around that, because I don't think that the general public accepts that at this time. I think they still think that great leadership is the self-promoting, very confident, sometimes bombastic leader that just sort of forces things forward, as opposed to these softer traits that you often see in women. Not that we're not as courageous, sometimes more courageous, I think, in transformational positions, but often do it in a different way.
I would say in the leadership searches that I've assisted with, without fail, the number one or at worst number two priority for every one of my clients is we really would like to bring in a diverse leader. A woman, person of color, someone with a disability background, something like that. So that's, and that wouldn't have been the case some time ago, so that's great to see. Now, upholding that value at every stage of a search and decision and that's the harder part, but I'm glad to see that. That's an affirming, at least instinct out of the gate. The change is slow. We need to make it faster, but it's funny, I was looking at my placements over the years, and 55% were women or people of color. And that was, and I serve a sector that, the not-for-profit sector, education, it's not like I serve financial services, but, but to me that was like, wow, it's happening. It's happening. Now, again, to your point, if you look at university presidents, 30% are women, but only 8% of those presidents are at doctorate granting institutions. So women sort of at the highest ranks, the most visible ranks, are what we're continually working toward.
I would it is, 11 to 25% is progress, and I'm thrilled about that. And it is true that now when I am, whether it's at my regional table in the Puget Sound, where I see far more women in the superintendent roles, and nationally when I'm at national events as well. So there's progress to be made. remain concerned, and I know we're supposed to talk about the good things, but I'm going to throw this concern in there too. I remain concerned about retention as well, because I have, and I love this distinction between mentorship and sponsorship. You are spot on. I have made it a practice of mine as a superintendent to develop others within the organization and without, to go on to the superintendency. And of the roughly 8 or so men and women that I have supported in going into the superintendency, 3 of the women are no longer superintendents over the last 6 years or so. And so that is where my attention is going right now. I think we've sort of figured out how to open the door, but what are the conditions that we have to put in place in terms of supporting women to do that well? And I will say that I think it starts from the get-go. There is a good friend of mine and colleague who's in a neighboring district where I am, and when she was offered her superintendency a few years ago, I reached out to her. I'd met her a few times. I said, congratulations. If I can be of help, please let me know. She's like, I'd love to come meet with you. So she comes in and we sit down and meet. And as just sheer luck would have it, she was in the midst of contract negotiation with her board. And she said, well, they're telling me that because it's my first superintendency, they're not going to pay me as much as the man that I'm following. And I said, okay, we're going to talk now. I said, the job is the job, whether you've done it for 1 year or 40. And I said, you take out a pencil right now, and I'm going to tell you what you're going to go back and ask for. And she did. She wrote down everything, and she texted me the next day, and she said, oh my God. She said, I got everything that I asked for. Of course you did. Because A, I wasn't telling you to ask for anything that wasn't appropriate and that you weren't deserving of, but most importantly, you asked. Right? And I think that those kinds of conversations, and I think that does link to the retention piece, because had she gone in with a crappy contract, her chance of staying wouldn't have been great. So what are those conditions we can put in place to not just get women into these roles, but keep them in these roles for the long haul?
Yeah. And support them to ask.
Yes. Demand that they ask.
Yeah. We were having a little bit of a conversation before this panel started. And I had just had a conversation the day before with a woman of color who had just become a district superintendent. And she said, don't you ever just do this because I'm a woman and I'm a woman of color. Do this because you know I'm the best. And where is there's conversations around setting goals and these could be 2 different things, so I'll highlight that and let folks, quotas around what you're trying to accomplish. How do you all see that? And do we have any difference of opinion? Should we or shouldn't we have goals or quotas, and are they different? And how do we ensure that there's not this bias towards just, we're just going to lower the bar in some way?
So can I just say, I reject so strongly. I want to say a word worse than crappy, but I won't.
Oh, so do I. I'm trying to keep it clean here.
I have a T-shirt that says I'm classy, but I cuss a little. That would be appropriate right now. I reject this notion that inclusivity and quality are somehow mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. This question, actually what underpins this question is deeply rooted in bias and supremacy and a belief that anything that is other is somehow less qualified, and I reject that. I think you have to believe at some level that women, those who identify, folks of color, are somehow innately less qualified in order to believe that somehow getting to a place that is more inclusive is going to cause the quality to decline.
Do you think the mindset's out there, though?
I think that, yes, we exist, like the fiber of our being in this country is based on a notion that other is worse and inherently less inferior. And we have to just call that out and we have to acknowledge it. But what we have to elevate are the counter examples. Mm-hmm. We have to elevate that, hey, when I So my work is we invest in leaders of color and are very explicit about saying we're preparing folks for senior and executive level roles. Our cohorts of leaders are traditionally 60 to 70% women. And I have had funders who have asked me, do you think that maybe you should be a bit more focused on men? And are you having to make any compromises? Like, these are questions that have actually been asked of me. Now, fortunately, I have the data to support that. Yes, while our cohorts have been typically had more women than men, when you look at that leadership pipeline, I can make a strong case for why we need to overinvest in women, because they are the ones who are typically falling out of the pipeline when you get to C-suite roles. But I'm sorry to get, actually, I'm not sorry. I take that back.
Sorry, not sorry.
I'm not sorry.
I think it was inappropriate.
But I hear this, and I appreciate you for asking the question and just saying the thing. Yeah. Because we hear it all the time, and what we end up doing is responding to that question versus questioning the validity of what is bringing the question forth.
Yeah, great. Great
So
question.
let me build on that a little bit. So I am both a woman and an immigrant in this country. Growing up in this country, the message we always receive from my family is, if you want to be treated like everyone else, you have to be better. You're going to have to be straight A. You're going to have to do this because you will never be viewed as equally. So it's kind of the same, getting at the same thing you're talking about, of this notion of, how do you get this equity? And then along those lines, at the same time, I think women often have the internal narrative of they're not quite as good, they're not quite as effective. And I think of myself personally, I've been in my role 9 years now, and it was this time when my board was asking me, please stay on, we need you to stay on, that I said, I will stay on if you give me the pay that a man would make in this role. 9 years into the institution. And the interesting thing was the internal struggle, because I'm like, well, I don't really need all that money. I'm okay. I don't need all that money.
I'll take it.
But it wasn't about.
It's not the money.
It was about.
Yep.
I want to get treated equitably because I've more than proved that I can manage this institution and probably save that institution. But I'm like, it took me 9 years to believe I could ask for that. I should have asked for it about maybe 9 years ago.
Can I just say, and Michelle Best is in the audience, and she mentioned this on a panel yesterday, and I just think this stat is important, particularly for the women and those who identify in the audience. We typically don't believe that we're ready.
Right.
So we will not apply for jobs unless we meet 100%. We've all seen those bullet points. We go through and we're like, yes, yes, yes. Oh, no, shoot, I can't apply, right? And that is not how most men typically view that process. They will apply with 60% of the qualifications. And these are things that we just have to know, and we have to challenge within ourselves. Like I think everybody, we're in this time where we talk a lot about social emotional learning for young people, but aren't doing that work ourselves. And part of what we have to unpack as women are these limiting beliefs about our worth. And no one else can do that work for us. We can't. It's wonderful to have allies and supporters, and I appreciate all the men who have frankly been sponsors and supporters in my life. But that belief that I deserve the same amount, that has to come from me. Like it actually, and you have to fake it until you really believe it.
And we have to change the narrative,
right?
Because the narrative's not going to change for us. We have to change the conversation, and I think we do. To your point, Carmita, to your point around challenging the bias, challenging the fact that we're even asking some of these questions at all, and calling that out, because in having that conversation, we're changing the narrative, right? Absolutely. And I think that we have to stop at some point letting the little things pass. Do you know what I mean? So this is a stupid example, but it's, I think, indicative of what we are still going through. So I just recently got the board gave me a small increase to my salary that everyone else in the organization got, but because I'm the superintendent, my critics in the community came unglued because, I'm overpaid and underqualified and all that kind of stuff. And the chatter on Facebook among some of my critics was that not only am I overpaid, but I also have a hair and clothing allowance. Which, of course, I do not. Well, actually, I do. It's called my salary, and my husband will tell you I spend an inordinate amount on it, but that's my choice. But this notion that that's the topic of the conversation, not just that I'm overpaid, but that I have this secret hair and clothing allowance. And my chief communications officer, who's a woman, was really incensed. And she said, if you were a man, no one would be commenting on A, your salary at all, and B, whatever perks you're getting in addition. And so, while those, and I am guilty of letting that stuff go, but I think more and more, and maybe it's because I'm getting older, I don't let it go anymore, right? And I do think that we need to challenge it, because by chipping away at the little things, we can change the narrative at a bigger, more important level.
I agree.
Can I want to triangulate the three last comments we've had. Carmita, with your just like, I reject a paradigm, right? To, Susan, what you just said about I'm not letting things go as much. And Nivine, to your point about, I was just told I had to work harder.
Right.
So what's the tension? Or is there? Do you have to prioritize one over the other? Can you hold both in equal state in regards to hitting up against the paradigms and confronting them, and also, there may be differences of opinion on this, but I'd love to hear, is there a tension in this or no tension at all? And how are we seeing shifts, and how do you carry this?
I think it's nice getting older. Because it has, like you, I've gotten less
tolerant.
Well, I just don't feel like I have to accept it anymore, right? I don't have to prove anything anymore.
We would call that giving fewer fucks.
I vividly remember. You're right. I vividly remember. About 5 years ago, sitting in a board meeting, and it was we are a huge teacher preparation university. And it was in the midst of the craziness of no one wanting to become a teacher anymore, and this whole narrative in our country around teachers are these horrible people. They don't care about their kids. We need to go in there and fix it. And who's we? It was typically these white men who ran big companies and thought, I can run a company, I can run a country, and I can fix the school system. And so, and it was just this incredible narrative. And I finally one day in my board meeting said, I hit the table and I said, I'm sick and tired of this. This is just another veiled way of criticizing and undermining women. And my board was also a lot of white men, and they looked at me like, what are you talking about? And I said, you really don't have a clue, do you? I said, only in this country could we get away talking about women in such pejorative terms and think it's okay. We lambast this profession. We don't even attack attorneys like this, and they're a lot easier to attack. We're attacking their character, we're attacking their commitment, and have you actually met these people doing this work? I said, this is an attack on women, and if you read about what happens in cultures, when you start attacking women like that, it is the beginning of the downfall of your culture and your economy. It has to stop. It has to stop. I would have never said that before then. Today, I will not tolerate it because I think it's a bad thing.
I say a lot more like what Carmita just said, to be honest. I'm just trying to keep it together today.
Punctuation at the highest level. But actually, there was a little bit of kind of whispering and a comment that happened in addition to the punctuation.
It was part of her T-shirt.
Around, and I quote, as I've gotten older.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
If we are committed to being true allies, supporters, all those things, advocates, what are we saying to the next generation?
Yeah.
How do you carry this? What's it look like?
Try to get them sooner to find their voice and to bring all of themselves to the table.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think...
Give them permission.
Absolutely. I think it does, and I was just talking to colleagues last night about we do work with emerging professionals from 28 to 40, and average age around sort of 32, 33. And I'm constantly hearing, Surge is this transformational experience that has changed my life and been the greatest leadership development that I've ever had. Yes. If I had a collar, I would pop it. But
She had a
what?
what? A collar.
It's already popped.
But what breaks my heart is to think that someone had to wait until they're 30, they're 40 in order to have
Keep
that,
going.
50, 60, to have that experience. So one of the things that has been very heavy on my heart is how we take what we are learning through our work with adults and go down the chain to say, how are we working with young women and young folks of color in college and high school? And I do think part of this work has to be about rejecting this paradigm that you have to leave parts of yourself behind in order to be successful. We have all, but particularly women and folks of color, are told explicitly and implicitly that there are things that you cannot bring forward with you. I very vividly remember, this was in business school, and another woman actually said to me, and this was another woman of color, we are still great friends to this day, and she thought that she was giving me, she was helping me, and she pulled me to the side and she said, Carmita, you shouldn't tell anyone that you grew up in the projects.
Really?
Because if you didn't say it, we would think you were just like us.
Wow.
Now, I don't have to tell you that I used some choice words in my response, but the message in my response is actually both of those things are true. I did grow up in the projects. I am just like you in the sense of being worthy, and quite honestly, I've had to be better than you. And I share my story because I need the little brown girl who's in the project somewhere to see me and see herself. And I need the adults like you to see me and see her. And I think we all have to think about ways in which we are enabling that for young women, young men, so that they don't have to have this breakthrough in their 40s, 50s, 60s.
And I will say too, I do make it a point to mentorship, sponsorship of younger women as well. And it's not that you can't be fierce and 30, right? I'm just a lot more fierce at 50 than I was at 30. Now, are those conversations I can have with my younger female colleagues to encourage them to find their voice sooner and not wait till, old age is upon you to really get after it? Yeah, I think so. But I also do not see, youth as in any way a hindrance, right? You're talking to the person who at 34 took over teaching and learning for the state of Pennsylvania. So, it doesn't have to be a barrier. But I just do think that there is something with age that perspective and wisdom and just no tolerance for the BS anymore, for lack of a better term.
I want to ask Jackie. Yeah. You're a recruiter.
Yeah.
And I'm putting you on the spot.
It's okay.
What would you say if you were coaching women coming in and they're young? Do they need to adjust, adapt, whatever the right word is, and are they more likely to get a job when they do?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I spend a lot of time, so just to be clear, in my role, I work for the client or the organization, but I spend, my whole stock and trade is sort of building rapport and trust with people who are going through very exposing and vulnerable processes, which are these sort of leadership searches. And so I spend a lot of time coaching and talking through with women the things they need to think about. And to be honest, unfortunately, we live in a hegemony where being tall, having a deep voice, talking slowly, speak. These are the things that we associate with leaders. So there's a little bit of, you're probably right, there is a little bit of us trying to become men. The golf thing, somebody just told me last year I need to learn golf. I was like, give me a break.
Pass. You need to learn how to shop for shoes.
Yeah.
You want to talk to me about leadership?
I'm not
That's where
learning
it's going to happen.
Are you kidding? So there's a little bit of and when I'm coaching women in the moment today in 2019 to get a job right now, is there a little bit of like, yeah, you got to have some characteristics that we associate with men leaders? That's probably true. Now, I don't want to perpetuate that endlessly, but there's just a little bit of that reality.
I asked it for a reason.
Yeah, I think it's right. And I think just to
Gotta
get
be
back to the points that were being made, I mean, again, the hegemony we live in is not the one that we want in terms of what we expect leaders to look like. And I think we just need to continue to push women. I mean, I know, again, I mentioned this earlier, but when I was being pushed along in my career, I almost felt obligated because my mentors and sponsors were pushing me. And so that's a little bit of the way we probably can play on that, is when I'm pretty conscious to push and make younger women underneath me, but below me sort of in the career ladder, feel that I'm watching them and I'm expecting you to rise to the occasion that I know you can. And so sometimes I do want to play a little bit on that sense of obligation that women have, because they'll look back and be glad they did.
So the push was good.
Yes, it was. I mean, at the time I felt obligated and a little, I was daunted, but I mean, I'm so glad that happened.
So what I would add is I think we have to make explicit, particularly in this age, rightful age of promoting authenticity in leadership, that you can be authentic to who you are and your values, and recognize that you may have to flex so that it can be received by your audience. And that isn't a compromise. So I often say when I'm out pitching Surge, selling Surge, I may have to change what I say in order to be heard, but I'll never change what I do. Right?
Well put.
So and I think we have to understand that there's and hold what feels like dissonance when, if you know that you're going into an interview and what is going to be seen as leadership traits are, a certain style of speaking or a certain I'm never going to speak like someone else because that just wouldn't be me. But I don't necessarily cuss in the interview either,
Fair point. You said that for the panel. Yes, exactly.
I said that for publicly recorded panels. But in all seriousness, we are born having to adjust, right? Like you don't speak to your grandmother in the same way that you speak to your girlfriend, right? And so I think I believe that as I'm coaching and supporting both women and folks of color, I really try to support people in saying, what are the authentic pieces of you that you must hold on to no matter what? And for me, that's I'm not going to wear a black or blue suit. I'm not going to, there are certain things about me that I am just going to show up in the way that I show up. Now, I may use different words in order to make sure that you can hear me. And I think people have to find that line for themselves. And we owe it to them to be honest about what is going to be expected and what is going to be supported, and give people the information that they can opt in or opt out of.
And can I just say too, I want to just bring up the issue of social media. Because I think especially for newer leaders coming into a very public leadership role, and college president, superintendent, you are public, making sure that your presence on social media doesn't incite even more criticism. And it doesn't even have to be anything crazy. But I mean, at the end of the day, the narrative, on superintendents, this notion of, they're all overpaid and this sort of thing, they don't need to see you in the Galapagos Islands with a monkey on your shoulder. There's nothing wrong with that. God bless you, are entitled to go on your vacation and live your life, but the community doesn't need to see it. And I do think that we've got to have some really hard conversations with our younger leaders coming up to just make them aware, to your point, do you, but do you on your own time. And remember that now that when you step into these roles, you are a public figure, and it is highly politicized, and as a female, you will be highly criticized. And so I'm not saying that you can't, again, be you, but you have to be smart about your presence out there. And I don't think we talk about that enough with leaders that are coming up into these roles.
Couldn't agree with you more. We've got about 2 minutes left before we kind of wrap. Let's riff for a minute. 10 years from now, what's different?
Hopefully we won't even have to have this panel. That's where I would start.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
We'll have made a few more points of progress. That's about it. I feel like it's incremental. It'll keep going, but I don't see any big radical changes in the. Tell me 30 years, and maybe I could see some radical change.
I won't necessarily be called a very strong female superintendent, right? It's just, wow, she's a strong superintendent, period.
That'd
But
be
we
good.
still put that qualifier in there. And I'm guilty of it too. I mean, I succumb to that as well. But if we could eliminate those qualifiers, we'd be in a better place.
Strong female woman of color superintendent, right?
Jack, you want to look different on the recruiting front?
Well, I hope it won't have to be so, what's the right word? We work really hard for it in every recruiting, which is good. I mean, we should want to have to work to uphold that value, but it's a lot of work, it's a lot of pushing people along, and it's a lot of like, time out, what are we trying to do here? Let's like reframe this, and I just hope it's less of that, that's not so needed. But it is right now. I mean, it really is.
Can I also add that I think I would love to see us be in a place where we elevate and acknowledge and support the genius of feminine leadership. And I say feminine explicitly because I don't just mean in women. I think feminine energy and feminine leadership traits are the glue that they build communities, we build nations. And if we could celebrate that even within men, if we could allow our men to be vulnerable, if we could allow our men to be authentic, I think that we will all be better off and better served when we recognize and acknowledge the unique brilliance of the feminine and support that and amplify it in both men and women.
Mic drop. That's the one to end on.
Join me in thanking this distinguished panel.
Trisha's right, you are brilliant. And a badass at that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah.